Hello, we should be live right now. I heard your guys' suggestions from the first and second stream to increase the volume, so I attempted to play with the settings. So if anyone ends up watching over here in the next couple of minutes, please let me know. And if you're watching the replay, also let me know if the settings have changed and if it sounds better on your guys' end. So today we are going to be responding to a famous kind of polemical argument used against the Catholic Church, which originated from a French priest named Launoy. Now, Launoy was a famous Gallican, so he was a Frenchman, and also he had various qualms with the, ultramontane party, you may call it, the papist party even, that eventually won out, though some people will quibble with that and note that they didn't completely win out, but it kind of became the dominant force in the 1800s, especially around the First Vatican Council. Now, the Gallicans would typically, for example, reject certain aspects of the papacy, and Launoy, in his treatise here that we're going to go through on the papacy, and in this specific case, Matthew 16, is often frequently cited by both Anglicans as well as some contemporary Eastern Orthodox who are borrowing from Anglicans to make their polemics against the Catholic Church. So I actually want to begin with sort of summarizing the argument. And before we get into Launoy's treatise, I actually just want to read from a book by an Anglican here. His name's George Salmon. He is a theologian and mathematician, actually, who is kind of known for his polemical works against the Catholic Church. And in this book, The Infallibility of the Church, he responds to not only the claim that the Church is infallible, because he rejects that, but also the infallibility of the Roman Pontiff. So here's what he has to say about, the French priest Launoy. He says, the most elaborate examination of the opinions of the fathers is in an epistle by the French Roman Catholic Lanoi, in which, besides, the interpretation of Peter was the rock, for which he produces 17 patristic testimonies. So he's saying that 17 church fathers say that Peter is the rock. He gives the interpretations that the rock was the faith which Peter confessed, supported by 44 quotations, that the rock was Christ himself, supported by 16, and that the church was built on all apostles, supported by 8. So kind of what's going on here. So Launoy kind of just wrote up a list of various authorities that he had access to, and he said, oh, look, they say Peter's the rock here. They say the rock is Peter's faith here. The rock is Jesus Christ here. And the rock is all of the apostles here. And he just kind of lists them up. In my opinion, he doesn't do a lot of evidentiary weighting sort of stuff. And that's essentially what he does. So another kind of contemporary source that gets into this argument is Michael Whelton. So Michael Whelton, in his book, Two Paths, and this book is really popular. If you're ever in a kind of Catholic church where a lot of people are converting to Eastern Orthodoxy, this is going to be one of the ones that people bring up. And even among people who don't necessarily read Whelton, they seem to borrow a lot of their polemics from him, whether they know it or not, in the contemporary Eastern Orthodox space. So he has this to say about Lanoi. This is page, this would be his chapter 1. This would be the first page of chapter 1, page 22. So here's what he says about Lanoi. He says, the Orthodox Church has always maintained, however, that the early church saw no theological basis in Matthew 16, verses 18 through 19, to support the claims of Rome, stating rather that most of the early church saw in this passage that Christ was building his church, not on the person of Peter, but on Peter's confession of faith, and therefore was not declaring him to be the sole foundation of his church. A much-quoted survey compiled from the Roman Catholic scholar Jean de Lanoi finds that 17 fathers taught that the rock was Peter, 44 taught that it referred to Peter's confession of faith, 16 thought it referred to Christ himself, and 8 thought that the rock represented all the apostles, i.e., 80% of the church fathers did not recognize the person of Peter as the rock. So this kind of Launoy's methodology in paper is something that has really permeated both contemporary and historical anti-Catholic polemics. And in fact, it's something that I still see on Twitter. In fact, when I was discerning between going the Eastern route and the Catholic route, it's something I would see on Facebook. So this is something that still exists to this day and is frequently cited, despite the fact that it was written centuries ago. Now, I'm not going to go through this page by page because, as you can see, it's in Latin. However, I have summarized it in this little Excel sheet over here. So let's pull this up, and maybe I should make it larger. Let's see if I can do that. Okay, hopefully that's somewhat visible in your guys' screens. So if anyone can't see this or needs it to be bigger, let me know. In fact, maybe I can make it even a little bigger. So let's just go through the lists, and this is just his list. So I just pulled from his work, and this is not, I haven't touched a single thing. So these are the lists that we're talking about. So this first one, Peter's the Rock. So these are authors that Launoy himself. So again, I'm not criticizing Launoy's methodology yet. I'm just presenting his exact list. So here's just the list. So as you can see, 17, that corresponds with the list, the count of Whelton, that corresponds with the count of George Salmon. So again, I seem to be reading Lanoi correctly. I got 17 people. The second column is me. I did some, a little bit of sleuthing around here. In other words, I just Wikipedia hunted all these people to ensure that I got their proper date of death in here. So this is the date that they died, not necessarily the date they were writing, but the date they died, and then their name. So let's just go through them here. We have Tertullian, Origen, Saint Cyprian, Saint Firmilian, Saint Hilary, Saint Basil, Saint Ambrose, Saint Epiphanius, Saint Gregory of Nazianzus, Saint Jerome, Saint Augustine, Saint Cyril, Pope Saint Leo the Great, Maximus of Turin, Michael Sellos, Theophlactus of Orcrid, and Euthemios Zagabenus. Okay, so these are the 17 authors that Lanoi has identified as saying that the rock in Matthew 16 is referring to Peter. And in fact, before we continue, I'm kind of assuming that everyone is familiar with Matthew 16, so maybe I should just pull up Matthew 16 on the screen really quick for anyone not familiar with Matthew 16. We can go with the Bible Hub one because they have all the translations. Here we go. So Matthew 16:18 is obviously the verse we're talking about. ESV says, "And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." So again, if you guys have a Bible handy or just want to look it up, Matthew 16:18 is kind of the passage that we're discussing here. So just want to do that really quick backtrack for anyone who's a little bit lost here. Okay, so the second group now we're talking about are the patristic authors that Lanoi has identified as teaching that the rock is all the apostles. And again, here's a list of the 8 authors that corresponds with what we cited. Here's the date of death of all of the authors. Yes, we'll get into that, guest 3200. We'll get into all of this stuff. So the date of death of all the authors, as well as the names. So you can see Origen, Cyprian, and as you can tell, these are people that were on the previous list as well. Origen, Cyprian, Jerome, Augustine, Theodoret of Cyrus, Ambrosius Ansbertus, Aetherius of Beatus, and Pesachus Radbertus. And I'm probably mispronouncing a lot of these, so I apologize if that is the case. So that is the second group that Lanoi says, that he went through. Now let's get to the next group, the longest group, which is that the rock is Peter's confession of faith. So this is going to be a relatively long one. I'm actually, I'm not actually sure if I want to read all of these just because of how long it is. I will. Why not? All right. So again, the number, date of death, and the name. So let's go through the names. Eusebius of Laodicea, Hilary, Gregory of Nyssa, Ambrose, John Chrysostom, Augustine, Acacius, Cyril, Juvenal of Jerusalem, Pope Leo the Great again, Peter Chrysologus, Theodoret of Cyrus. He has an anonymous writer on here. We'll talk about that in a little bit. We have Eucharius of Lyon. We have Pope Felix III. We have Pope Hormisdas. We have Anastasius of Antioch, Pope Gregory the Great, Isidore of Seville, Venerable Bede, John Damascus, Pope Hadrian I, the Council of Friuli, Jonas, the Bishop of Orleans, Hinchmar, the Archbishop of Reims, Pope Nicholas the Great, Pope John VIII, Theophanes, Theodore Abu Qura, Pope Stephen V, the Tropian Council. And I was a little confused at this one. This one I had to do a little sleuthing to find. Odo, Robert, the Abbot of Toutersis, Innocent II, Pope Hadrian IV, Pope Urban III, Caesarius of Heisterbach, Thomas Aquinas, Stephen the Bishop of Paris, Alonso Tostado, Jose von Klichtavi, Johann Eck, and Rene Benoist, and the Roman liturgy itself. And then we have this final fourth group, which says that the rock is Christ. And again, his list of authors here is Jerome, Augustine, Theodoret, Bede, Paulinus, Dungal, Rabanus Marus, Anselm, Peter Lombard, John of Salisbury, Godfrey of Viterbo, Pope Celestine III, Innocent III, Caesarius of Heisterbach, St. Thomas Aquinas once more, and Pope Pius II. So that is the list that Lanoi produced, and this is the list that Anglicans and contemporary Eastern Orthodox have been citing without any, critical thought. They just say, Lanoi has this list, here's his number, boom, there's my argument, papism refuted. But I'm sure that all of you guys watching, and in fact, I see guest 3200 pointing this out, a lot of these guys are in multiple lists. So that's interesting. And another thing I'm sure you guys notice is, what is this being quoted as? So remember in, Salmon here, he was saying that this was an examination of the fathers, the church fathers. That's how this is being presented in his polemic against the Catholic Church. And, the Eastern Orthodox here, Michael Whelton, he also says that this is about the church fathers here. And, Michael Whelton, given that he's Eastern Orthodox, I'm unsure why he would care about the opinion of Pope Innocent II, Pope Urban III, Pius II, Thomas Aquinas. In fact, it's very odd that this is being presented as a list of church fathers when, in fact, a huge number of those on this list are medieval theologians, post-schism, both East and West. The first critique of the Launoy list, especially as the way it's used, is it's not even a list of patristic authors at all. It's a list of theologians, some of whom happen to be church fathers, some of whom happen to be from the patristic era, but many of whom are not. So that's the first problem with this argument. The second problem with this argument is, as I already noted, there's a lot of people who are on multiple lists. So the first thing I did when looking at this Lanoi list is all I did was put a cap. So if they died after the year 800, I thought that was a kind of fair cutoff to get the patristic period. And you can already see that group 3, that is that Peter's faith group, that list shrinks by 50%. It goes down to 22, and all I did was say, if you died after the year 800, I'm not counting you. So basically making it an actual list of patristics, and his list is cut in half. And in fact, his group that says that the rock is Christ, which, by the way, we'll get into that later about how a lot of these interpretations aren't even wrong and don't even go against Catholic teaching, that leads to a 75% reduction in the list. In fact, the rock is Peter group barely changes at all. It just goes down to 14. So it's a much smaller change here. So another thing that we're going to point out here is that in a lot of these, so in the red, so let's see if I can zoom this in again here. Why is it letting me zoom in? Oh, boomer tech moment. So these names in red, these are people that were on 3 or more of the lists. So we see Jerome is in 3 lists. He's in group 1, rock is Peter, group 2, rock is the apostles, and group 3, that the rock is Christ. And we also have Augustine in multiple of these groups. He's in group 1, that the rock is Peter. He's in group 2, that the rock is the apostles. He's in group 3, that the rock is Peter's faith. And he's in group 4. So he's in all of them, that the rock is Christ. So Augustine's clearly seeing Matthew 16:18 in a polyvalent manner. We also have a ton of people that are in groups in 2 lists. So we have Origen in these 2 groups. We have Hilary in these 2 groups. We have Cyril, we have Ambrose, we have Venerable Bede, multiple groups. So again, we have tons of authors clearly seeing this in a polyvalent manner. And we're going to get into a little bit as to why that's the case in a couple minutes here. And then finally, we have a group in green, which this kind of relates to guest 3200's comment here, and that there are people who should be in group 1 as well. So these are people that should be in multiple lists, but for whatever reason, Lanoi only listed them in group 3. That's Gregory of Nyssa, who should also be in group 1. That's John Chrysostom, who should also be in group 1. And we'll get into these quotes in a second. We have Pope Felix, who should be in group 1, and Pope Gregory, who should also be in group 1. So just in this first correction, where all I do was basically just put a filter on the year, we can already see that it's no longer looking like a slam dunk for the Peter's Confession crowd. It's actually shrinking dramatically, the gap between the rock is Peter and the rock is Peter's faith. And again, I have not left Launoy's framework at all yet. And just simply staying within Lanoi, we're already seeing how his methodology is beginning to break down. So let's do the next thing. Well, and another thing I want to talk about here is this anonymous writer. So this anonymous writer, if we get into my notes here, basically, I think I put it here. So the anonymous writer is from a Catena of Nicetas, who is an 11th century Greek. So I don't want to be the type of person claiming forgery, but I think there's a legitimate case that he probably shouldn't be counted in this list at all. We don't know who he is. We don't know his authority. We don't even know if it's a legitimate quote, given that it's from a medieval compilation. But I try not to, but I didn't want to delete it because I didn't want to just be, like the Easterns who always claim, my forgery. But that's just kind of an asterisk that I wanted to put here. That some of you may disagree with me in the fact that I left it here. Some of you may actually argue that it shouldn't be included at all. And in fact, I would probably sympathize with that a lot, but at least with this first correction, I wanted to leave him in the count for Peter's faith. So in this final correction, I actually do end up removing the anonymous writer, and this is just basically what I did in 30 minutes. Like, I didn't spend a huge amount of time, preparing for this stream. I was basically able to just, based on what I already know, my previous knowledge, pull up some quotes, and I'll pull up the quotes here in a second. But essentially, I was able to identify a couple extra writers here, as well as the ones here that I noted that should also be in Group 1, so Gregory of Nyssa, John Chrysostom, etc. I put them in Group 1, and what do we get here? Well, in just a couple seconds of research, or a couple minutes of research, I'm able to get the list to equal each other. 21 authorities on both sides. And just like that, Launoy's, claim that there is a huge, 80% of the church fathers reject this view is totally eliminated. And in fact, I also did a little, because I like to do data stuff. So in fact, the average years of the testimony in Group 1, so that the rock is Peter, is actually older, so a century older than those in the group that are saying it's Peter's faith. In this first group, those who are saying Peter's the rock, we actually get the year 414 as the average year of death, whereas the average year of death is 500, a little after 500, 502, among the group who says Peter's faith. Now, in fact, there's even more authors I could appeal to, but I chose not to appeal to them because I'm a big primary source guy, and it's because I haven't actually read the primary source work of these saints. So that's St. James of Nisibis, Ephraim the Syrian, Passian, Asterius, Pope Boniface, Ambrosiaster, who is he was originally for a long time attributed to St. Ambrose, but recent scholarship says that it wasn't St. Ambrose, most likely. Pope Gelasius, Felix III, and St. Siricius. Now, if you want some secondary sources for this, and I think I put these in the description, I recommend Keys Over the Christian World by Butler and Colarafi, which can be purchased on Robertson Genesis website, as well as Father Batala's book, which is free on archive, The Pope and the Church, Considering Their Mutual Relations. And Batala actually follows Launoy's methodology and has a count himself. And if you add these up, you get about 30 now early church fathers from relatively early periods all saying that Peter is the rock. So the idea that this is some rare opinion, that this is some later Catholic medieval, or even, post-medieval invention, if you're going to follow Launoy's, methodology here, is simply not the case. Clearly, the view that the rock is Peter is a very well-supported patristic testimony. Now, I want to get into some of the primary sources here regarding these couple authors that I just rapidly added to the Peter is the rock side in order to refute Lanoi. Now, I just kind of copy and pasted these excerpts into a Word document. You guys can accuse me of quote mining if you want, but all of these quotes and links are in the description, so you can try to read these in as much or as little context as you want. So let's start with John Chrysostom here. Now, the thing that I did with Chrysostom is Chrysostom actually writes a lot about Peter. It would actually be, I think, really burdensome to go through every single place where he writes about Peter. And if you want a really good secondary source that goes through a lot of Chrysostom's stuff, Dom John Chapman's book, The Early Papacy, exegetes a lot of Chrysostom's works. But I actually wanted to stick specifically with the work that Launoy was cited here, which is Homily 54. Because Homily 54 is what Launoy uses to support his argument that Chrysostom believes that the rock is Peter's confession of faith. So I'm just going to read these quotes here. And again, if you want to read these in more detail, I highly invite you to click the links in the description. So here's what John Chrysostom writes. He says, "What then says Christ? You are Simon the son of Jonas. You shall be called Cephas. Thus, since you have proclaimed my Father, I too name him that begot you. All but saying, as you were the son of Jonas, even so am I of my Father. Else it were superfluous to say, you are the son of Jonas. But since he had said, Son of God, point out that he is the Son of God, and the other son of Jonas, of the same substance with him that begot him. Therefore he added this, and I say unto you, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church." That is on the faith of his confession. Now note, this is where Lanoi stops. So he just says, boom, faith of the confession, argument over. What's going on in the comments here? Oh, okay. I hereby officially respond to you, Matthews, since you asked for a response. So here you are. So this is where Lanoi stops. So he just says, boom, Chrysostom says the faith of his confession is the rock. We're done discussing. But Chrysostom actually goes on. So let's keep going and see what Chrysostom is saying here. Quote, again, I'm quoting Chrysostom here. "Hereby he signifies that many were now on the point," and I don't know why this is tiny font. "Hereby he signifies that many were now on the point of believing, and raises his spirit, and makes him a shepherd. And the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And if not against it, much more not against me. So be not troubled, because you are shortly to hear that I shall be betrayed and crucified. Do you see now that he, his own self, leads Peter on to high thoughts of him, and reveals himself and implies that he is the Son of God by these two promises? For those things which are peculiar to God alone, both to absolve sins and to make the church capable of overthrow of such assailing waves, and to exhibit a man that is the fisher more solid than any rock, while all the world is at war with him. These he promises himself to give. As the Father, speaking to Jeremiah, said, he would make him as a brazen pillar and as a wall. But him only one nation only, this man any part of the world." So let's just keep going here. So, before I read this next paragraph, clearly what's the point I'm trying to make here? So yeah, he's saying that the rock is Peter's confession, but he's also relating it to first him as a shepherd, and he's relating it, leads Peter. And then he's saying that the fisher, that is Peter, because Peter was a fisherman, is more solid than any rock. So he is not disconnecting Peter's faith, Peter's confession, from Peter the person. He's saying that they're one and the same thing. Peter's faith and Peter's confession is an attribute that Peter has in and of himself. And as the Catholics would say, that therefore applies to the Petrine office and is then inherited by his successors. So Peter is himself the rock because of his confession, which is his own. And that's exactly what John Chrysostom here is arguing. That's exactly the point Chrysostom is making. So, sure, he's saying that the rock is Peter's confession, but that confession is also making Peter himself the rock. So he is not seeing these two interpretations as mutually exclusive. And as we'll get to into a moment, that's exactly the Catholic position. Let's just continue the quote here. "I would fain inquire then of those who desire to lessen the dignity of the Son, which manner of gifts were greater? Of those which those which the Father gave to Peter, or those which the Son gave him? For the Father gave to Peter the revelation of the Son, but the Son gave him to sow that of the Father and of himself in every part of the world. And to a mortal man he entrusted the authority over all things in heaven, giving him the keys, who extended the church to every part of the world and declared it to be stronger than heaven. For heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away. How then is he less, who has given such gifts, effected such things?" So again, he's saying he's given authority to a mortal man, again, that is Peter, over all things in heaven. And also he's now saying that he's giving him the keys. So he's giving Peter the keys in some sort of unique sense. So this is exactly the Catholic position on Matthew 16. And again, I would make the argument that this quote in full that Lanoi quotes actually should put Chrysostom in both groups 1 and 4, not merely in just group 4. And that undermines Launoy's argument that these church fathers are even interpreting this in a mutually exclusive manner. And in fact, if you're familiar with the corpus of Chrysostom, you know that Chrysostom not only just talks about Peter the Rock, but he talks about Peter the Coryphaeus, the choir master. He calls him the foundation. But I just thought it was suitable to refute Lanoi using the exact same passage that Lanoi himself was working with. So overall, Peter is clearly individually made the rock because of his confession, and Chrysostom does not contradict the Catholic view, hence why I placed him in the Peter equals the rock group as well. So let's go to the next. So Gregory of Nyssa, and here's a nice short quote. This is from his 2 homilies concerning St. Stephen, and he says this: Peter, the chief of the apostles, is recalled, and the remaining members of the church are glorified with him, for indeed the church of God is established upon him. This is in accord with the Lord's words, who made him the firm and most solid rock upon which he had built his church. So again, I don't necessarily think this needs too much exegesis. He's very clearly identifying Peter as the firm and solid rock upon which the church is built. He's referring to him as to the chief of the apostles as well. So clearly, Gregory of Nyssa is holding a very high view of Peter, which is very consistent with the Catholic exegesis of Matthew 16:18. So let's go to the Synod of Whitby. So if any of you guys watched my previous stream on England, I actually already quoted this council. I think in that video, I quoted it from Venerable Bede's work. Here, I'm actually quoting it from the life of Bishop Wilfrid. If you want to see Bede's, narration of events, feel free to check out that video or buy Bede's book itself. Again, it's very cheap on Amazon, and I love Venerable Bede. I said it last video, I'm going to say it again. I think every English-speaking Christian, regardless of your denominational background, should be reading Venerable Bede. But here's what an interesting, thing that happens at the Synod of Whitby in far pre-schism England. So it says then, after St. Wilfrid the priest had given his speech, and I guess I should give context for anyone who hasn't watched that previous video. So there was a controversy occurring in England between the Irish and the English. And the English were following the Roman custom of the dating of Easter, whereas the Irish had their own custom, and it was leading to issues where, you had these mixed marriages where you'd have one person following the Irish, one person in the Celtic version, one person kind of following the British version, the British custom. And there was kind of a debate as to should we follow the St. Columba, or they claimed Columba is the one who instituted this, Columba's dating or the Roman dating. And the Synod of Whitby concludes we should follow the Roman dating, and the Celtic Church and the English Church begin to, at this point, universally follow the English dating. And St. Wilfrid, he got up and he gave an apologetic saying that you need to follow the Roman See. In fact, this is a really interesting papal proof in general, because he says you are sinning if you aren't following what the Apostolic See, that is the See of Rome, had decreed on this topic. So after St. Wilfrid finishes his speech, the king now interjects and says this. King Oswu smilingly asked them all, tell me, which is greater in the kingdom of heaven, Columba or the Apostle Peter? And the whole synod answered with one voice and one consent. The Lord settled this when he declared, quote, Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And I will give thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever shalt loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. And the king wisely replied, He is the porter and keeps the keys. With him I will have no differences, nor will I agree with those who have such. Nor in any single particular will I gainsay his decisions as long as I live. So again, remember the context. Rome is saying, follow us. The followers of Columba are saying, follow her. St. Wilfrid gives an apologetic for the Roman custom, and the synod, in this case, both the synod and the king, are applying Peter and the promises made to Peter to the Bishop of Rome. And what is that promise? Well, the promise is that, because again, they're talking about the relative authority of Peter versus Columba, and they're saying Peter has more authority. Why? Because he was declared the rock and he was given the keys. So this very clearly is identifying Peter as the rock. So the Synod of Whitby should clearly be in that first column. And then we have Pope St. Gregory. So Book 5, Letter 20. This is, in fact, the very famous work of Gregory in which he goes against the title Ecumenical Patriarch. So if you are an Eastern Orthodox or a Protestant, you're probably very familiar with this letter.
And in my opinion, in this letter, he very clearly identifies Peter as the rock. So he says this: "For all who know the gospel, it is apparent by the Lord's voice, the care of the whole church was committed to the holy apostle and prince of all the apostles, Peter. For to him it is said, Peter, do you love me? Feed my sheep. To him it is said, behold, Satan has desired to sift you as wheat. And I have prayed for you, Peter, that your faith fail not. And thou, when you are converted, strengthen your brethren. To him it is said, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." And again, he just closes off quoting Matthew 16. But what is key here? So he's saying to him. To who? To Peter. So to him, Peter, it is said. And then even in John 21, which he's also using as a Petrine passage here, he's saying to him. So he's clearly saying to Peter it is said, and obviously what is said to Peter? That upon this rock I will build my church. So Pope St. Gregory the Great, and there's other instances in his works as well, but this is just the first one that came to my head. He's clearly identifying the person of Peter as the rock upon which the church is built. So we have St. Epiphanius in his famous Panarion, again linked in the description, and he says as follows: "Thus the Lord and his church accept the penitent, as Manasseh the son of Hezekiah returned and was accepted by the Lord. And the chief of the apostles, St. Peter, who had denied for a time, and still became our truly solid rock, which supports the Lord's faith, and on which the church is in every way founded." So what do we have here? Peter is what? Chief of the apostles. Peter had problems, denied for a time, but became what? Became our solid rock, which supports the Lord's faith. And he is what? On which the church is in every way founded. Because again, remember, the whole imagery here is that, you're building upon a solid stone. So whenever, Peter's referred to as the foundation, they're referring to Matthew 16 typically. And that's exactly what he's doing here. If you look in the Panarion, he's exegeting Matthew 16 directly. So you guys can feel free to read this as well. Again, it's linked in the description. And then we have Pope St. Agatho in his letter to the Sixth Council. Now this one's especially interesting because it was accepted by the council and is therefore arguably binding upon the consciences of both Catholics and Eastern Orthodox in a magisterial perspective. So here's what Pope St. Agatho has to say: "Who does not hate and rage against and avoid such blind errors, if he has any desire to be saved and seek to offer the Lord at his coming a right faith? Therefore the Holy Church of God, the mother of your most Christian power, should be delivered and liberated with all your might, through the help of God, from the errors of such teachers and the evangelical and apostolic uprightness of the Orthodox faith, which has been established upon the firm rock of this church of blessed Peter, the Prince of the Apostles, which by his grace and guardianship remains free from all error. That faith, I say, the whole number of rulers and priests, of the clergy of the people, unanimously should confess and preach with us the true declaration of apostolic tradition in order to please God and to save their own souls." Now, what's important about this? So he is referring to the apostolic see, so his see, the Roman see, as the Church of Peter. And he's referring to it as what? The firm rock. So he's saying that the Roman see is a firm rock of the church because it is inheriting these prerogatives from Peter, which obviously he's referring to Matthew 16 here. And he's also saying, obviously, he's the Prince of the Apostles. And he's even talking about his faith. So he's saying that Peter's confession is the reason why he's the rock. This rock-like quality is inherited by the Roman see. And the Roman see is therefore the firm rock upon which, the church is built and the faith and the orthodoxy of the church is built upon. So once again, Pope St. Agatho is very clearly making not only a papal claim, but he's exegeting Matthew 16 in a way that he's saying he inherits that prerogative in a unique way in some sense, which is, again, consistent with the Catholic view of Matthew 16, because we're saying that this rock-like quality of Peter is inherited by his successors in the Roman see, by the Roman pontiffs. So, just like that, we have multiple authors, which Lanoi didn't even consider, who should be in group 1. There's plenty more that I haven't fully read through their primary works, which is why we're not going to go through them today. But there's at least 9 more. I'm sure that if I spent, a week, looking at this topic, I could probably find dozens more. So essentially, I would make the argument that, this Lanoi thing isn't even that convincing because me, a random guy on the internet with an internet connection who spends maybe an hour at most, kind of going through the stuff that I already know about, was able to already put it at parity, staying within Launoy's paradigm. Like, I'm not even going after Lanoi because, like, the listing thing is kind of problematic as well, because you really need to weight. Like, what should you weight more? So Pope St. Agatho here, that letter should be weighted really highly. Why? Because it was accepted by an ecumenical council. And in fact, now that I'm streaming, I just noticed that I forgot something. But that is the Council of Chalcedon, and I don't have the quote in front of me right now, but I'm gonna get it and put it in the comments of this video and pin it. But the Council of Chalcedon also says that the rock is Peter. So we now have two ecumenical councils, the Sixth Ecumenical Council, by accepting Agatho's letter, as well as the Council of Chalcedon, two of them, saying that the rock is Peter. That should end the debate right there. Because if you're doing a balancing test, the individual fathers matter much less than ecumenical councils, which represent not only the views of everyone present, so that would probably represent, 100 or 200 or 300. I don't remember how many bishops were at Chalcedon. I think it was 300 or 400 maybe. So that not only represents the opinion of those 300 to 400 bishops, but it represents the opinion of the church, given that it is an ecumenical council accepted by the entire church and approved by the Roman pontiff. So you have two ecumenical councils. That should end the debate. And you have like Lanoi doesn't really even get into these weighting questions. He just does a list, which I think is problematic. But again, the point of this video is to respond to Lanoi, and I think it's best and most convincing when you refute people within their own framework. And I've already shown that using his own internal framework of just counting people up, I can force a tie in just 30 minutes of research, and with more time, I could guarantee I could do the reverse of Lanoi and just swamp him with those people saying that the rock is Peter, the person. And again, I think it's really important to remember that this Lanoi list isn't actually a church father list at all. It includes a ton of medievals, which isn't how it's presented by those using it, which actually makes me think that most people who use this haven't actually read Lanoi. All they've done is read people like George Salmon in these secondary sources, and then they just run with it and they say, oh, well, this Anglican scholar here said that this is a list of fathers, and that's how they present it. But when you actually read it, you see that's not the case at all. So another thing I want to get into is a couple secondary sources. Please forgive me, most scholars here. But I want to get into a little bit of contemporary scholarship on this point, because I think it's just important to know that contemporary scholarship is pretty unanimous that the rock in Matthew 16 is referring to the person of Peter. So the first one we're going to look at is Trevor Jolland. He's an Anglican scholar. He's the author of the book, The Church and the Papacy. And his book is, I believe Eric Ibarra always says this is his favorite book on the papacy other than his own. So let's look at what this high church scholar has to say. So we're going to go to his book on page 97 here. Here we go, 97 and 98. So here's what he says, and it's actually interesting because it explains why. Because remember how we were noting that the church fathers were not in singular groups; they're in group 1, group 2, group 3, group 4. Here, Jolland is going to get into why that is. And I would also note that the Catholic view also explains why that is, because we do believe the verse is polyvalent and has complementary rather than contradictory meanings. But Trevor Jolland gets into this here. So he says this, quote, "The patristic authors who comment on tu et Petrus show no sign of having attempted to interpret it in light of a hypothetical Aramaic original." Because it's important to note that Matthew is originally written in Aramaic and later transcribed in Greek. Had some of them been aware of the probability that the single word Kepha underlines both Petros and Petra, they would not have attempted to press a difference in meaning between the two Greek terms. In fact, it is this ignorance which serves to account for a somewhat remarkable diversity in interpretation, traceable not only as been the writings of one author and another, but sometimes even between those of the same author. So what is he saying here? He's saying that if you understand the Aramaic original that is using Kepha and Kepha, obviously there is no change in meaning here, and rock is simply referring to Peter. And he's saying that given that, the kind of modern view scholarship which is determined that Matthew 16 was originally written in Aramaic wasn't yet present, we now have an explanation for that the church fathers simply didn't have access to because of the period they lived in. And then he says here at the end, "It may be said, however, that the evidence as to the patristic views has exegetical interest only since, to quote a modern Protestant writer, it is quite certain and now generally admitted that the words 'this rock' refer not to Christ, nor to Peter's confession of faith, but to Peter himself." Okay, so Trevor Jolland, I believe this book was written in the 1940s. He is saying that modern scholarship of Protestant varieties, because again, he's an Anglican himself, and he's quoting a Protestant author here. He's saying that it's generally accepted that the rock is referring to Peter the person. Okay, so that is the view of the Anglican scholar Trevor Jolland. And now let's talk about Edward Strzynski in his book, The Papacy and the Orthodox. And again, I highly recommend people read primary sources. But this book is actually pretty good in my opinion, and this is something that PineSap has said before, and I just want to reiterate it. I don't understand why people will read this book and not become Catholic, because I think that Strzynski kind of cedes too much. Again, assuming Strzynski's correct, he cedes too much ground. Now, obviously, you could read it and just say, I think he ceded too much ground and remain whatever you are. But if you're reading it and you're actually thinking that Strzynski is correct in his scholarship, he cedes a lot to the Catholic position in many areas of his book. But fundamentally, he's an Orthodox scholar. And let's just see his summary of how modern Eastern Orthodox scholars view Matthew 16. So I think I have that here. Okay. So this is page 70 of his book. Modern biblical scholarship, focusing on the saying in its presumed original language, Aramaic, where the wordplay employed by Jesus comes across more clearly, you are Kepha, and upon this Kepha I will build my church, has increasingly come to a consensus that Peter, Kepha, is indeed the rock. So here he's talking about general biblical scholarship, Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant, everyone. He's saying has increasingly come to a consensus that Peter's the rock. Now, this next paragraph is interesting, though, because he's going to talk about specifically Eastern Orthodox theologians. Now, what do Eastern Orthodox theologians say? He says this: even among Orthodox theologians, this conclusion has taken hold, although there remain those who continue to uphold the traditional view, and as we noted, it's not necessarily the traditional view. But anyway, there remain those who uphold the traditional view, that is, that the rock is the confession of faith and not Peter personally. Increasingly, however, Orthodox scholars, and maybe I should see if I can zoom in so you guys can read along a little easier. Here we go. Orthodox scholars, such as Veselin Kasich and Theodore Stylianopoulos, have joined the growing consensus and acknowledge that Petra or rock does not simply refer to Peter's faith, but also to Peter personally, for there is a formal identity between Petros and Petra. Jesus will build the church upon Cephas, okay? And then he goes on to say this: that Orthodox scholars have gradually moved in this direction must be applauded, wrote Stylianopoulos. From the standpoint of critical scholarship, it can no longer be disputed that Jesus' words to Peter, as reported in Matthew 16, 17-19, confer a special distinction on Peter as rock, the foundation on which Christ has promised to build his church. So what do we have here? We have a more recent scholar. So I think this book was written in 2017, so it's not that old, just a couple years ago. He's saying that first, biblical scholars generally across all stripes now say Peter's the rock. And what else is he saying? That Eastern Orthodox scholars also now have come to this conclusion as well. So let's now go to an evangelical scholar, because I'm trying to get everyone here. So we have the high church guy and summarizing high church thought, saying Peter is now the rock. We have the Orthodox guy saying that, yeah, modern Orthodox that are intellectually consistent and rigorous now say that, yeah, Peter's the rock. Now let's go to an evangelical scholar named Donald Hagner in his Word Biblical Commentary, volume 33b. So, where is that one here? Here it is. So here's his exegesis of Matthew 16. He says, the natural reading of the passage, despite the necessary shift from Petros to Petra, required by the wordplay in the Greek, but not the Aramaic, where the same word Kepha occurs in both places, is that it is Peter who is the rock upon which the church is to be built. And then he quotes various Protestant scholars that hold that view. And then he continues, the frequent attempts that have been made, largely in the past, so he's saying this is a past thing, not a present thing anymore, to deny this in favor of the view that the confession itself is the rock, e.g. most recently Carangius, seem to be largely motivated by the Protestant prejudice against the passage that is used by Roman Catholics to justify the papacy. So, what is this evangelical scholar saying? He's now saying that even he, an evangelical, is recognizing that Peter is the rock. Scholarship is increasingly recognizing that Peter is the rock. And generally speaking, when people try to deny that Peter's the rock and that it's rather the confession, this is generally motivated by trying to justify one's preconceived notions. Can you share the exile file with us noobs? Yeah, I can probably do that. I can probably upload it to Google Drive and put it on the video description. Anyway, sorry, I'm getting distracted by the comments. We now have 3 scholars. So again, we have one reading from a high church scholar in the 1940s, I believe, saying, yep, modern scholarship is now saying that Peter's the rock. We have something really recent, 2017, confirming that consensus still holds to this day among not only Protestant scholars and Catholic scholars, but also Eastern Orthodox ones. And we have another volume from an evangelical scholar. I believe this was written in the 1980s or 1990s, so kind of in between Jolland and Szymanski, showing that this consensus has remained strong throughout the entire period, beginning, middle, and end, and again is accepted by low church scholars like this author, high church scholars like Jolland, and Eastern Orthodox scholars like Szymanski. And again, the primary sources matter way more than this. I'm just kind of quoting this for people who seem to, care about what scholars believe in for whatever reason. Now, the last thing I want to get into is what the Catholic Church actually teaches about Matthew 16, verses 17 through 19. Because let's just say, for sake of argument, Lanoi was right. Let's just say everything about his list, everything about his weightings was correct. A majority of the church fathers say that it's Peter's faith, not his person. Let's even say that these modern scholarships also were saying that. Catholic as well. They're saying, yeah, we think it's his faith. Would that undermine the Catholic position? Now, let's read here the Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph 552. Now, before we read this, let's also talk about the status of the Catechism. So the Catechism, from what I understand, is a part of the magisterium, is part of the ordinary magisterium of the Church. So we are, as laymen ourselves, obligated to assent to what is in the Universal Catechism, and it says this regarding Matthew 16, paragraph 552, quote, Simon Peter holds the first place in the college of the 12. Jesus entrusted a unique mission to him. Through a revelation from the Father, Peter has confessed, "You are Christ, the Son of the living God." Our Lord then declared to him, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it." Christ, the living stone, thus assures his church, built on Peter, of victory over the powers of death. Because of the faith he confessed, Peter will remain the unshakable rock of the church. His mission will keep this faith from every lapse and to strengthen his brothers in it. Now, this paragraph has a lot in it. So first, what is Christ? Christ is the living stone. So remember what Lanoi said. Lanoi has a whole list of people who say the rock is Christ. And in fact, in Lanoi's estimation, just as many people say the rock is Christ as the rock is Peter. Well, guess what? The Catholic Church, in a period well after the First Vatican Council, which has defined papal infallibility in a way that no one can reject it anymore in the Catholic Church, is saying the same thing. So clearly that position doesn't contradict us, because Peter is a stone. Why is Peter the rock? Not because of any thing in and of himself, because his faith was given to him by God, and he's being strengthened by Christ. So Christ is truly the rock, and Peter is the rock only insofar as Christ has deemed him such and has given him these qualities. So we are fully on board with the idea that Christ is the rock. And he continues that the church is built on Peter, but why is it built on Peter? Because of the faith he confessed. Okay? So Peter's the rock because of the faith he confessed. You can't separate the confession of faith from the man himself. Therefore, all of these interpretations can be seen as harmonious with one another rather than contradictory. And if that's the view you have, which is the view the Catholic Church has, then, you essentially, that basically explains it all away. So, but not only is this necessarily in fact, I had a note somewhere here about a couple other things I wanted to bring up. Okay, yes. So, now you might be saying, Alexander, that's cool, but the Catechism of the Catholic Church is modernist, and it's ecumenist, and, you guys are just saying that because you're coping, we're always coping, and, epistemology, bro. And I'll say, okay, let's go to some older Catholic teaching here. So this is a book that PineSap sent me a while ago. It's called Papal Teachings of the Church. And it's actually really good. I believe I linked it in the description, but if I didn't, just ping me and I'll try to fix that. But it's on Internet Archive. And it's basically just excerpts from primary sources from the papal magisterium. And it was compiled by, the Benedictine monks. So I want to talk about a couple things here. So I want to start going to, I think it's Clement the 13th, if I remember right. I think it's this one. Yes, okay. So again, it's just talking about Peter here. So this is in the encyclical Aequo Die Nobis, which was written in 1758. So we're looking at over a century before the First Vatican Council. So this isn't some modern post-Vatican I cope to try to fit things into place. And it just very distinctly says that Blessed Peter was enlightened by the Father, and not by human wisdom confessed that he was the Son of the living God. So this isn't like a super deep, exegesis of Matthew 16. I'm obviously not using this as a definitive proof of my case here, but I am saying that clearly the church is seeing the confession of faith by Peter as an important aspect to the story here. It's an important aspect to the rockness, and it's has an important aspect to the Petrine office of the papacy. So again, the idea that this isn't some sort of polyvalent verse that can be read multiple different ways is not the Catholic view. In fact, the Catholic view sees it in that manner. So next we can go to, I think it is Pius the Seventh here. So this would also be well before the First Vatican Council. So he says here, the foundation of the church. It is in the face of these facts, it should be recognized that it is vain to endeavor to destroy the house of God, that is the church built upon Peter the rock. Not alone in name, but in reality, the church against which the gates of hell shall not prevail, because it is founded upon a rock. None has ever been an enemy of the Christian religion without at the same time waging an impious war against the chair of Peter. Because while this chair stands, the church will never tremble or fall. Okay, so this first part is basically the, saying that Peter's the rock, straight up. That's what it's saying. But now he's going to be quoting St. Irenaeus in his encyclical and therefore adopting this point of view into his magisterium. And he says this. In fact, as St. Irenaeus proclaims, it is by the institution and succession of the pontiffs that the truth is handed down from the apostles and taught to us within the church. And it is also the same succession which plainly demonstrates that one single life-giving faith is the one which, within the church, has been kept from time of the apostles till now and has been faithfully transmitted. So again, guys, why is Peter the rock? Because he has a life-giving faith. Where did that faith come from? It obviously came from God. It came from Christ. Therefore, Christ is also the rock. You can kind of implicitly read that into this if you want. But you know what? Let's not even try to insert our views into this text. Let's just stick to what it says. But why is Peter the rock? Because it is with his successors that there is a life-giving faith. In other words, why is Peter the rock? Because of his confession of faith. So again, we see this kind of, this confession of faith and the foundation of the church at Rome, as well as the faith that is transmitting, are all interconnected. You can't read these things as distinct from one another. And if you do so, you basically, if you read it that way, if you read it the way Lanoi tries to read it, you are inserting contradictions not only into the patristic corpus, but between the same authors, one against themselves. Like, are you really going to say that St. Augustine is going to be contradicting himself in the interpretation of this passage 4 different times? No, he sees the passage as complementary, and that's the Catholic view as well. So let's go to Pius IX. Now, Pius IX, I think, is an interesting case here because Pius IX himself, he was the Pope during the Second Vatican Council, and let's just see what he has to say. Such was Peter's faith that must be our own. Faith was the strongest characteristic of the Prince of the Apostles. It was which made him answer Christ, Tu es Christus filius Dei vivi. Thou art Christ, the Son of the living God. This was it which was for him the title of blessed. Beatus est Simon Bar-Jonah, quia caro et sanguis non Okay, I can't say that right now. Tibi, blessed art thou, because neither flesh nor blood has put on the lips of the confession of my divinity, but because it is my eternal Father who has revealed it to you from heaven. From this comes the order establishing Peter as the foundation of the church. It is true that Jesus Christ is the foundation of the church, that he is the cornerstone on which the majestic temple is built. But Jesus Christ willed to associate himself his vicar. And in the contact of the two foundation stones, Peter the apostle obtained a share in the greatness of Christ. So what do we have here? We very clearly have Jesus is the rock. Boom. So all of those views here that Lanoi lists in his group 2, not inconsistent with Catholic teaching at all. In fact, the very man who headed the First Vatican Council, approved the First Vatican Council, and no one can deny was, definitely ultramontanist leaning of some form, he very clearly held to the rock is Christ. So nothing here contradicts our view. Second, it's obviously very clear from this that he holds Peter is the rock himself personally. So obviously that first group isn't contradicting anything the Catholic Church teaches. And finally, why is Peter the rock? Because of Peter's faith, which must be our own. And it was given to him not from himself, but it was Christ. It was God who gave him that faith. But it's still his. Like, it's something that that has become part of his person. Think of the whole, created grace thing. Like, sure, if you have a rod of metal and you light it and the rod heats up and it starts to turn red and glow and expand, sure, it's only expanding because of the external factor being applied to it, that is the heat, the lighter, but it's still a characteristic of the metal that is expanding. So in the same way that Peter's faith comes from God and not from his own nature, so it's only is being given to him by God, it's still something that is his. It's still his characteristic, and you can't separate the two. So you now have Blessed Pius IX teaching exactly what the modern catechism says on this, and as well as saying that Matthew 16 can be read in a polyvalent manner, and that all of these groups of thought, all of these quotations that Lanoi is quoting to say that, papism debunked or whatever, I guess in his case it would be papal infallibility debunked, because he would have held a view of the papacy much higher than Whelton and Salmon and other Eastern Orthodox, as well as Protestant and Anglican polemicists. Still, the way the Catholics read this prevents contradiction, whereas the way that our adversaries interpret it induces contradiction. So the next one I want to get into is let's see if I can find it here. I think it is. I think this is here. I think this is it. Okay, so this is Pope Leo XIII. This is in his famous encyclical Cited Congitum. So this is his famous encyclical defending the prerogatives of the Pope. In fact, if you guys are familiar with anti-Catholic polemics, Edward Denny's book is kind of written in response to Pope Leo XIII's encyclical here. So let's just see what Pope Leo XIII has to say here. He says this: "He willed then that he whom had designated the foundation of the church," so again, he's clearly seeing Peter as the person, as the foundation of the rock here, "should be the defense of its faith. Could not Christ, who confided to him the kingdom by his own authority, have strengthened the faith of whom he had designated a rock to show the foundation of the church?" So again, we have the faith of Peter here being strengthened by Jesus. We have Christ being the rock in some sense. All of this is, again, this is all part of the same story being told, not in contradiction. And then he continues, "For this reason, Jesus Christ willed that Peter should participate in certain names, signs of great things which properly belong to himself alone, in order that identity of titles should show identity of power. He who is himself the chief cornerstone, in whom all the building being framed together groweth up in a holy temple of the Lord, place Peter, as it were, a stone to support the church." So again, he's now very explicitly, there's no implicitness here. He's explicitly saying that Christ is the chief cornerstone, that is the rock, but it is because of Christ's rockness that he's able to make he's able to make Peter a rock as his vicar. And this is when he says that when he heard "Thou art a rock," he was ennobled by the announcement. However, he is a rock, not as Christ is a rock, but as Peter is a rock. For Christ is his very being the immovable rock. Peter, only through this rock, Christ imparts his gifts and is not exhausted. He is a priest and he makes priest. He is a rock and constitutes a rock. Once again, the meaning of the verse is polyvalent. And then the last one I want to get into here is Pius XI. So this again is post-Vatican I. We're getting into the early 20th century, but this is pre-Vatican II. So for those of you who don't like the post-Vatican II era or whatever, you aren't getting any of that here. And here is what Pius XI has to say. Faith in the church cannot be maintained pure and free from error if it is not based in the belief of the primacy of the Bishop of Rome. In the same moment in which Peter, before all the apostles and disciples, professed faith in Christ, the Son of the living God, his faith and his profession were rewarded by Christ's answer. The word which founded his church, the one church on Peter the rock. Faith in Christ, faith in the church, faith in the primacy stand together, therefore in sacred close connection. So again, Peter's the rock, boom. But why is he the rock? Because of his faith in his profession. And that's why he was rewarded by Christ, okay? So long story short, you have the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which would be promulgated by Pope John Paul II. You have Pope Pius XI. You have Pope Leo XIII, Pope Pius IX, Pope Pius VII, and Clement XIII, all very clearly reading Matthew 16, verses 17 through 19 in a very nuanced manner, in a way that does not cause contradiction. Because if you are going to insist on just one of these interpretations, you are going to be causing the patristic authors to be contradicting not only one another, but themselves. Okay? And if you really seriously think that Augustine would contradict himself and hold 4 different positions without very clearly, like you think that would have had a whole list, like in his work Retractions, when he's kind of talking about the mistakes he believes he's made in his theological works. You think that would probably end up in there if that was the case. But clearly he didn't, because Matthew 16, verses 17 through 19 are polyvalent. All of these readings are harmonious with one another, and all of these readings, in my opinion, support the Catholic view on ecclesiology. So that's basically all I wanted to get into today. I hope this was edifying for you. If you have any questions, please let me know. And I guess before I sign off, let's see if there's any pressing questions here in the live chat here. People seem to be talking about soccer or something like that. Okay. Yeah, it seems like that's it for today. So that's all I had planned. Thank you for watching this video. If you have any comments as to how to improve these videos, please throw them in the comments. I'm new at this. I have no idea what I'm doing. And if you have any videos you would like me to, or any topics you'd like me to cover, also throw that in the comments. So thank you. Please like, share, and subscribe this video. And obviously, as I'm going to say in all the videos, please read the primary, and in this case, a couple secondary sources I provided so that you can further increase your knowledge on this subject area. And then also, hey, you can share it with your friends as well, those resources.